Okay, I think we're going to begin. Welcome again, everybody, to the webinar entitled "Strategies for Feeding Cows with Limited Forages." Today, I'm going to be serving as your host. My name is Dale Blassie, and I serve in the Department of Animal Sciences and Industry as a beef specialist. And today, with us, Dr. Jason Warner. Jason has been with us almost 1 year and serves in our department as the extension specialist for cow-calf production. And with that, Dr. Warner, a Nebraska native, spent some time in allied industry as a nutritional consultant. And so we look forward to hearing his thoughts for dealing with limited forages. Dr. Warner.
Okay, thanks very much, Dr. Blasi. Appreciate the introduction. And yes, we're going to talk some about limit feeding and how that concept can be applied to cow-calf systems and managing cow herds as we think about managing through some situations and some challenging times that we have right now in the cattle industry, not only here in the state of Kansas, but also in other areas as well too. So we hope that you find today's information beneficial and informative, and that's our goal with it. And so really, when we think about limit feeding cows, why would we want to consider doing this practice and doing this strategy? And really, there's a number of different reasons why limit feeding can be very effective for us. Limit feeding, I would say, is a concept or a practice that has been around for a long time and really has been implemented quite extensively and with backgrounding operations, growing operations, and of course in the finishing side of the industry. But it's maybe implemented not quite as often on the cow-calf side of things. And there's been some research that's been done over the last probably 20 to 30 years or so. But certainly we've learned a lot more in the last 10 years or so with how we can manage cows in these types of management situations. And really, at the end of the day, and especially for the purposes of this conversation, when we think about managing and reducing the use and the need of harvested forages, and why that's so important with today's situation, when we think about our forage and hay inventories around the country, it's really just truly a very effective strategy for minimizing harvested forage needs and ultimately at the end of the day reducing our cost per cow per day. Whether or not we see much of a large economic incentive or a reduction in our cost per day by limit feeding all just depends on the price relationship between whatever our forage costs are and the other feeds that we're going to be using to build or implement our limit feeding program with. So it all just goes back to whatever that price relationship is. If these other feeds and byproducts or forages that we can utilize, if they're quite cheap and harvested hays are expensive, well, then it would make sense for us to be able to do so, or it's going to be easier for us to be able to implement that and make that work. But at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that when we compare these feed ingredients, and we'll talk a little bit more about this here in a moment, but we got to make sure that we're comparing these feed ingredients that we're going to be considering to utilize in this situation, pricing them out on a cost per unit of energy basis, whether you evaluate that on a TDN or on an energy basis, regardless of how you look at that, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to fill that ration or build that ration around whatever is the most economical ingredient for us to use from a cost per unit of energy basis. There's some other things that regarding limit feeding that are important that are some benefits that we may not necessarily think about or maybe be quite as apparent to us up front. But we've seen this in backgrounding and growing operations. And in the finishing side as well too, anytime we put animals on a restricted intake or restricted feeding program, we know that reduces our manure output. And so that might have some implications and some benefits for us, for some producers in some management situations. But then also too, when we think about minimizing feed wastage and feed trampling, and we know that those are certainly important things we have to consider when we think about typical feeding programs with how we would manage cattle out on pasture or in calving and feeding grounds. We know that feed trampling and feed wastage contributes to fly loads and fly populations. And so going into this time of year, certainly that has some implications as well also. So another important consideration where we're minimizing our feed usage through limit feeding can be important. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it's very important that we think about some critical questions that we need to ask ourselves, and how limit feeding can be effective. And so if you're in a situation, I think if you're having to provide maybe more than half of what the animal needs on a daily basis in order to meet their requirements, or if you're in a situation you're asking yourself, do I need to remove cattle or take cattle off of pasture or even avoid turning out on pastures because we're concerned about long-term damage to the forage base or degradation to the grass. Those are some situations. If we're in those types of situations, that's where I think limit feeding can be really effective, and we want to consider this as an option. So a few important things here that we want to distinguish when we talk about limit feeding. So when we say limit feeding, and for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about feeding a limited amount of a high energy ration, not necessarily a high concentrate ration, but a high energy ration to achieve a targeted maintenance level for cows in order to maintain body weight and body condition score. So for the purposes of applying this principle to a cow ration feeding situation, that's the way we need to think about it. Certainly if cows are thin and we need to add body condition, then that's going to be our objective, but we're really targeting a ultimate amount of energy intake into that animal to simply maintain weight and body condition score. That's usually what we're trying to accomplish. And so we want to think about and keep in mind that we're usually going to be restricting cattle to maybe 3/4 or a little bit less of their ad libitum intake. And I think if for folks that grow cattle and that finish cattle, those producers are pretty well attuned to that. But I think when we think about applying that on the ranch or for cow-calf production systems, we're maybe not quite always thinking about it in those terms. And so, just as an example, if we think about a situation where we would have a cow that's going to be consuming 26 pounds of dry matter, 3/4 of that would be 19.5 pounds of dry matter intake. And so it's a targeted amount of energy to maintain weight and condition, but we know that intake is going to be less.
Excuse me, Jason.
Consume more than that. Yes, Dale.
We're not seeing you change your slides, so please fix your screen.
Okay, it's showing that it's changing on my side, Dale. You're not seeing in advance?
I am not seeing you change, progress your slides, and I would assume the audience is as well.
Are you seeing it progress in this format?
There you go.
Well, we'll just keep it on this format. Apologize for that, as long as that's large enough for everyone to see. Okay, thanks for catching that. So yeah, this first slide here is just describes what I just discussed here, and so I didn't get too far into it. And so really we're talking about restricting those cattle to a point that's going to be less than what they would typically consume on an ad libitum or to their typical fill. And so we want to keep in mind that the time when we do this, the time for them to be able to consume that ration is going to be much less, and those animals are going to quickly consume what they would need on a daily basis. And that's why bunk space is so important. And that's the first key point here that I think is really critical. So some key things we have to make sure that from a production standpoint that we address, and we want to make sure that we have in place in order for a limit feeding program to really be effective for us. And facilities is key. And it's one thing if you're going to manage cows in a limit fed situation, but if you're going to have calves that side with them as well too, you really got to make sure that you've got good facilities that can contain those cows and calves, and younger lightweight calves if they're 350 pounds or less. they can get pretty creative about getting out and finding holes and ways to get out. And so you just want to make sure that you've got good, good fences and good facilities in order to be able to contain them, and bunk space. And I've listed it there 3 times because that is really, really critical. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Equipment, of course, to be able to mix and deliver diets reliably, that's obviously very important in this situation where we're going to think about taking a TMR to a set of cows. And of course, increased management when we talk about being able to calculate out our ingredient costs, being able to put those rations together. And at the end of the day, the main thing that we're going to be working towards here is reducing our feed and forage needs and costs as well. Some important things I think that we really want to keep in mind with cows when we manage cows in these types of ration situations. Again, bunk space. I think you need to have a minimum of 24 inches linear bunk space per mature female, and you probably need to be closer to 36 inches or maybe more than that if they have cows at side. So I think for dry cows, 24 to maybe 26 inches of bunk space, but getting up closer to 3 feet, I think is really critical if you're going to be managing cows with calves at side on them. Thing you want to keep in mind is that cows are going to be discontent the first week to maybe 2 weeks when you first implement a limit fed type of a program with them. One thing that might be beneficial is if you start out with a higher level of intake, fill those animals up on hay initially, and then progressively and gradually work intake back and work intake down. I think that helps those cows adjust to that program more readily. And the thing that I've always observed when we've implemented this is that animals are creatures of habit. They will adjust and become very settled into their routine if you are routine with them. So that's why we always want to stress consistency and how critical that is. I think sorting on cows is really important. If you can sort by age, if your facilities and the size of the herd that you're going to be working with allows you to be able to do that, I think that's very critical. What we're doing there is if we can sort those more dominant older cows from those more timid females, we can help just minimize the variation that we might see there in terms of weight and body condition score. So those younger, more timid animals, we want to make sure that they've got more space, that they're able to get up there and consume their allotted amount of ration. We know that's really critical. I think in ionophore, this is a situation where that can be very effective for us. Of course, if you've got horses in with those cows, you want to keep that in mind and avoid that. Grinding forages is really important or important from a processing standpoint, especially on a coarser, more fibrous type of forage, a lower quality forage like a cornstalk hay or maybe a sorghum sedan type of a hay. You want to make sure that you're getting a good grind on those forages in order for them to mix well and reduce sorting. So when we think about hay wastage and the importance that has and how that can really impact the economics of a feeding system, we know that that's critical, but I think it's important to just keep in mind really where that is from a dollars perspective and how that can impact our operations really quickly. And so when you think about, hey, if it's lower price, right, we're not going to see as near of a big of an impact on the overall cost in the situation when we have hay wastage. But certainly as the value of that hay goes up, it's worth more. Waste becomes a bigger deal for us, right? And so when we think about looking at hays that if they're costing $250 or $300 a ton, and we have increases in waste out from 5 all the way out to 15 to 20%, well, maybe $1,500 or $2,000 using this scenario with 100 cows just over a 30-day feeding period, well, that can add up really, really quickly for some producers. So we really want to keep that in mind, and that reiterates the importance of why we want to try to minimize feed wastage. So cost per unit of energy becomes really critical, and I mentioned that previously when we start thinking about these different approaches with how we might put together rations. And so the important thing to to keep in mind with this slide that I want everyone to take away is we don't want to get so concerned about what the actual costs are that I'm using here for these individual ingredients, although I think they're representative. But we know that feed prices are going to vary tremendously from location and just due to availability and competition for feed ingredients and feedstuffs certainly is going to be a big driver of that. But what we want folks to think about is pricing those ingredients out on a cost per unit of nutrient basis and looking at that and identifying how those feed ingredients and how those feedstuffs can most effectively work for us. And just looking at this example, if we've got corn priced in right now, if we say it's $231 a ton, and I'm just assuming a 620 bushel price with some rolling and milling charges with an 85% dry matter or 15% moisture, 14 cents per unit of megacal or per pound of megacal based on the amount of energy that's providing for us. Compare that to alfalfa hay. An average quality alfalfa hay at $280 a ton is 27 cents per pound of energy that's being supplied there. So a significant difference there between those two ingredients, and that's the thing that we want to be thinking about when we think about putting these programs together. So how do we determine how much that we need to feed these cows or any given a set of cows in a situation with a limit fed program? And I think this is something that maybe is not quite as clear to a lot of folks as we think about putting these programs together, because there's a couple of different ways that you could approach this. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it all comes back to understanding what our energy requirements are for that particular set of females with where they are in their production curve. And so the thing that I would suggest or advise is identifying where those females are and understand where they're going to be at on average throughout the feeding period. And then we're gonna calculate that amount that we're gonna feed based on providing the amount of energy in order to meet their needs. And so of course we can determine this information from feed composition tables and nutrient requirement tables, or a formulation software program like Brands or something very similar to that. We can get that information from a number of different sources. When we think about how much that we need to feed when we're identifying that for a particular situation, we need to know first off the desired or the targeted energy intake that we're gonna try to target or pinpoint in the situation. And so just as an example, if we say we want to target 16 megacals of net energy for maintenance into this particular set of cows or into those females, we're also going to need to know what the energy concentration is of the ration that we're going to feed. And so just as an example, if we determine that our ration is 0.75 megacals per pound of net energy for maintenance, and again, there are a number of different ways that we can determine that, but then we also need to know the dry matter content of the ration as well. And so if we say in this example, if it's 65% dry matter, then it would be 35% moisture. So 3 important things we need to know and make sure we know: the desired energy intake, the concentration of the ration, and then the dry matter content of the ration itself. So as an example, if we say, okay, we want to target 16 megacals per day of energy into this particular set of females in order to maintain weight and condition, if the ration will supply us 0.75 megacals per pound of energy, then if we take those two things and we divide them out, that will tell us that we need 21.6 or 22 pounds per cow per day of dry matter intake in order to supply that animal with 16 megacals a day. So if we just divide the megacals by the megacals per pound, we'll get the intake that's needed there. But that's intake of dry matter. We always want to remember that we're looking at that on a dry matter basis. So if we say, okay, for this example, if the ration is 65% dry matter, then that would equate to 33.2, or we just call it 33 pounds per day on an as-fed basis that we would need to put in front of those animals. So that's how we would go about that. And one thing that you want to keep in mind is that when we're formulating on an energy basis, typically, you're going to see that the energy concentration and oftentimes the protein concentration in terms of the percentage of the ration is going to be higher than what you might typically think about, or what we might have in some situations. But again, because we're going to be feeding less total pounds, lower total amount, the targeted amount of nutrient, whether it's pounds of protein or megacalories of energy on a per day basis, is going to be what we're going to be targeting for in this limit fed situation. So here's an example of some rations, and this is from some data that was from a project that was done several years ago, but I think it does a nice job of demonstrating the different types of rations that we might consider and what performance might be in a particular situation when we think about using this on a set of cows. And so in this study, there were 3 different dietary treatments that were compared, and the first 2 were a combination of an ethanol co-product, either wet distillers grains plus solubles, or distillers solubles, corn condensed distillers solubles. It would be a liquid product, very similar to that, only it's a liquid form, at 41% of the diet on a dry matter basis, with the balance of the diet being corn stalks, ground corn stover at 59% of the diet. And they compared that to a diet of brome grass hay, corn stalks, and alfalfa haylage. And so probably higher inclusions of ethanol co-products than what we might see in a lot of situations. But certainly when we think about targeting the amounts of energy and protein needed for that situation, that blend worked really, really well here. And so as you can see, all these cows across all 3 of these treatments started at just under a 6th, maintained body condition score very well. And so again, they targeted 17 pounds of dry matter of either the wet distillers grains plus corn stalks diet, or the distillers solubles plus corn stalks diet, and compared that to a higher forage, higher intake ration. So 17 pounds of dry matter compared to about 22, almost 23 pounds of dry matter. And so we can see a pretty good difference there in dry matter intake, but very similar performance across all 3 of those treatments. And again, that was with non-pregnant, non-lactating cows. So here's another similar piece of data that I think does a really nice job of demonstrating, again, some different types of rations that we might consider. And so in this situation, these were late gestation cows fed during basically the last 90 days prior to calving, that 3rd trimester. And so they compared feeding a diet of 100% alfalfa hay in this first diet here, compared to a diet that was 30% wet distillers grains and 70% wheat straw on a dry matter basis. And also comparing that to another diet that was 20% wet distillers grains, 20% wet beet pulp, and 60% wheat straw. And so I think a couple of things that are critical that I want to point out from this data set is that in this situation, you can certainly take a high quality forage like alfalfa hay and limit feed that to a late gestation cow. And you can even implement that on a lactating female, of course, as well too. But making sure that you have an accurate energy value and an estimation of what that value is really critical. So they limit fed 17 pounds of hay and not quite 19 pounds of either of the other 2 diets. But the important thing to keep in mind here that I want to point out is that the actual energy content of the hay in this situation was less than what was anticipated. And so as a result, the cows in this trial actually had a greater negative change in body condition score when they were maintained on that limit fed hay diet than what they did the other 2 treatments. And so that just reinforces the point of having a good, accurate forage quality value there, and making sure that we're taking good, accurate forage samples, and we have accurate values there to work with. Because if we limit feed or restrict intake of a lower quality forage, performance will be negatively impacted there. And the other thing too that I think this points out, or this reinforces, is that we can have situations where cows will actually gain weight going into calving, but they can lose body condition score. And so because of that fetal growth, we can have a positive increase in weight in those females, but body condition score is actually going backwards on us. And that's an example of where that can happen. So we've looked at some situations here where we can implement ethanol co-products, some other byproducts, and feed those with low quality forages in these limit fed situations. But what about situations where we don't have byproducts available, or they're outpriced, they're not feasible for us to be able to bring into the ration, and certainly that would be the case for some producers in some situations, because we know that not everyone has access to those, and it's not always feasible to implement those in every situation. This was some work that was done actually at Ohio State a number of years ago, but I think really does a nice job of demonstrating how we can have good performance on a set of females with a whole shelled corn diet with a really restricted or limited amount of hay. And so it was a 3-year trial. These were spring calving cows that were maintained on these treatments from November to April of every year. I think cows in this trial calved in late January, early February timeframe. So this would include early lactation. 3-year trial comparing ad libitum hay to a diet with whole shelled corn. As you can see, when we look at the 3-year average, over 11 pounds of whole corn per head per day on a dry matter basis, with about 2 pounds, a little over 2 pounds of hay, of a 10% crude protein hay, and then a supplement. So really, when you look at the total dry matter consumption on average across those 3 years with those 2 treatments, those cows on that limit fed treatment, their intake was restricted almost by half of what the cows on the ad libitum hay treatment were fed, and very little difference there in terms of body condition score change or calf performance, and conception rates on average across those 3 years was actually numerically improved for those cows that were maintained on that limit fed corn diet. And so the thing that we always want to keep in mind is that even though intake is going to be restricted, if we manage those females such that body condition is adequate at calving and going into the breeding season, we would not expect and should not expect a negative impact on reproductive performance, and these data would certainly support that. So one question that producers might have that I think is important to consider is, okay, on a whole shelled corn type of a diet, a high corn, high grain type of a diet, is there a need to process that corn? I think it's a different conversation when we think about growing cattle and certainly with finishing cattle. When we think about managing cows in a limit fed situation, I wanted to show these data because these data would generally support that there would not be much of a response there or really any benefit to processing the corn when we limit feed those cows. And so in this situation here, in this trial, again, compared to ad libitum, full fed hay diet with whole shelled corn and hay or cracked corn and hay, and they fed a higher level of alfalfa hay in this study than in the study that I just discussed, but with similar amounts of either whole shelled corn or cracked corn. And as you can see here, very little difference there in terms of cow weight change or body condition score change. This trial would have been done from right at the start of the calving season going into breeding. So the fact that you have cows that are actually declining slightly in body condition score during that time period, not all that surprising. And the fact that they're similar across those treatments with similar calf performance values. And then when you look at subsequent calving rate the following year, no difference there among those treatments. And so again, this would suggest that for a whole shelled corn, a type of a diet with a limited amount of forage, probably not a whole lot of benefit there or any need for producers to process that corn in this situation. But again, I think for growing cattle and finishing cattle, that's a different discussion. Wanted to show some work that was done at the Hayes Research Station here at K-State several years ago. Some work with a different type of ration that I think is a good, that really just demonstrates just the different types of rations that we can see and how we might implement that. And then also too, what our considerations might be if we're going to manage those calves still on the cow going through that feeding period. And so in this project, they were looking at a sorghum silage and rolled milo or grain sorghum based ration. And so really they had three treatments: the control pairs that were managed on pasture, of course, and then they managed cows in the dry lot pens with either calves at side, and they wean them at a typical weaning age, or else they early wean those calves. And so when they left those calves on the cow and managed those cows with calves at side, they fed or offered a rolled milo and soybean meal type of a ration separately to those calves in a creep feeder. And if they early weaned them, that ration consisted of some sorghum silage, and then again with rolled milo and soybean meal as a protein source. So a different ration here, but between those two different treatments in terms of how they manage those calves, but I think would certainly be typical, and for many producers could certainly be a very typical diet that we might see in a lot of situations. Getting into the performance, when you look at cow average daily gain, was very similar across those treatments, although those pairs that were managed with calves at side all the way through the feeding period, average daily gain was less for them, but still cows were on a positive plane of nutrition. And when you look at body condition score at the end of the feeding period, cows anywhere from a low 4 to just over a 5 in terms of body condition. So really not a lot of spread there between those different treatments. And when you look at calf performance across those three treatments, calves that were out on summer pasture with their mothers gained just under 3 pounds a day, and 2.9 for both of those treatments. When calves were either managed in the dry lot there and maintained with their mothers, or if they early weaned them and they fed them that sorghum silage and rolled milo and soybean meal type of diet, gain right at the same rate. So and next week, of course, Dr. Wagner is gonna visit with us some more and get into more of the details on how we might approach early weaning and some different strategies with how we might manage those calves in that situation. But certainly we know that we can get acceptable performance there, and I think it all comes back to how we manage those pairs, and again making sure that you've got either adequate bunk space for those calves to be able to come up and consume ration with their mothers, or else providing a separate supplemental feed source for them, and we can get acceptable performance if we're going to manage cows and calves in that situation there. So really, when you go back and you look at the data from these three different trials, from the work from Ohio State, the work where they compared either whole, shelled, or cracked corn, and then the research that I just discussed there that was done several years ago at Hayes. Really when you look at it, comparing the limit fed treatments or approaches to situations where we would feed ad libitum hay, we saw a reduction anywhere from 30 to almost 50% in the total amount of feed that was delivered. And so really, I think just helps summarize this a significant feed savings in terms of the total amount of feed that's necessary to be delivered in those situations. And the thing that you have to keep in mind is that, again, the amount on a per day basis of that higher energy feed stuff, whether it's corn or distillers grains or another type of byproduct or silage, again, is going to be higher. That amount is going to be higher than what we would typically be used to feeding in a lot of situations. But it's that overall reduction in feed inputs that's really, really important. That's really going to have an impact here. So I want to talk just a little bit about some work that I was involved with a number of years ago that I think helps really kind of supplement and fit well with the information from the research that was done at Hayes there in the early 90s. And this was some work where we were comparing two different weaning treatments, either early weaning calves that were from cows that were managed in confinement or in a dry lot situation, compared to normal weaning them at typical 210 days of age or so. But from the standpoint of how we might think about managing those pairs where we leave those calves on those cows all the way up until a traditional weaning age. And so just to highlight what the rations were in this study, it was replicated over a couple of years and over 2 different locations. So we had different rations there across those years and the locations. But again, a high distillers, low quality forage ration using either corn stalks or wheat straw, or else we used a corn silage based ration with either distillers and corn stalks or wheat straw as a forage source in this situation. But what I want to highlight with this with this trial from the work that was done was that, another approach that you might think about doing if you decide that early weaning maybe doesn't necessarily fit your program, or if that's not a goal that you have, and it's easier to manage those pairs together, and you want to just leave the calves on the cow and manage them all the way through the season and up until a traditional weaning age. One thing that you could do, as long as you've got plenty of bunk space available to do it, is just make sure that you feed the exact same ration that you would, and you could just prorate or increase the amount that you're offering as you go, as those calves get bigger, to make sure that you're accounting for the feed needs of the calf, because that calf's growing and it's got to compete at the bunk with that cow for feed. And again, going back to the critical point of bunk space, why that's so important. Every amount that calf does not consume, those cows are going to consume, and certainly they're converting that feed, converting that forage and protein over to milk, which is critical. But we want to make sure that we get enough feed intake into those calves in order to stimulate rumen development and for them to properly grow. And so what was done in this trial was that we just matched the intake of the combination of the cows that were early weaned with the calves that were early weaned. So we can see in this first year, we limit fed the cows that we early weaned 15 pounds of dry matter. The calves ate about 8.5 pounds of dry matter, and then we just added those two together and prorated that same amount to the pairs, to the normal weaned pairs. Again, those calves weren't weaned until they were about 200 days of age, and so we just increased that over time as we went, and that worked really well. And upon completion of the trial, there was really little difference there in terms of calf performance, and the total amount of feed that was delivered into both treatments was the same. So it's a method that you might think about implementing as you go. So I think we've got some good information there showing some differences in some different types of rations that we can set up, looking at current costs. And again, going back to calculating out that cost per unit of energy, if we think about some different approaches here, a typical ration, if we just limit fed alfalfa hay as we described, if we limit fed that to a gestating cow with today's costs, if it was $280 a ton of alfalfa hay, and I'm assuming $5 a ton for delivery, an additional grinding cost as well too. If we look at that with the intake of a little over 20 pounds of dry matter just to maintain that cow, these costs would suggest a little over $3 a day, $3.38 per cow per day. If we compare that to either a wet distillers and wheat straw treatment that we looked at, or a corn silage, wheat straw, alfalfa hay diet, or that whole shelled corn alfalfa hay diet, we can see a significant difference there in terms of what our cost per cow per day might be. And certainly you need to think about what your yardage cost would be. And I'm not accounting for that in this situation. I'm just looking at the straight ingredient costs based on the intakes that are utilized here. And then again, accounting for some delivery and some grinding costs as well too. But we can see a significant difference. And when we think about either a high corn silage, wheat straw, alfalfa hay type of a diet where we limit feed our dry forage, our alfalfa hay, and our wheat straw, if those are more limited for us. But if we have a fair amount of silage to work with, or again, that a whole corn alfalfa hay type of a diet, if it's implemented correctly and we manage it well, it could certainly be a very economical or a more cost competitive approach for us than feeding a higher amount of a higher quality forage. One last thing, and then I'll wrap up, that I want to discuss and mention is that, you know, there's a lot of situations where, depending on how cows are managed, maybe taking and delivering a TMR to those cows on a daily basis is not necessarily going to be feasible for us. But can we just accomplish the same thing by restricting access to free choice forage? If management would dictate to us that it's much simpler and much easier to manage cows on free choice forage, depending on what those feeders look like and what that equipment looks like, can we accomplish the same thing? And these data would suggest yes, you can. This is some work where they took cows immediately after calving all the way up until the start of the breeding season, and they limit fed them or restricted their access, I should say, to free choice hay to either 4 hours a day, 8 hours a day, and compared to 24 hours a day access. Initial condition score on these cows was right at a 6. Again, as we think about managing cows from the time of calving going into the breeding season, they did see a more negative impact on body condition score change when they restricted cows to only 4 hours of access. But again, that goes back to, as we discussed previously, making sure that if you're going to implement only a forage-based ration, if that's going to be the sole component of the diet, making sure that you understand what the energy levels are so we can target what our intake needs to be appropriately. And so, you know, those cows that were allotted 24 hours or continual access maintained condition very well, but we saw a little bit more of a negative impact there when we restricted down to 4 hours. But very similar calf performance across those treatments. And importantly, of course, when you look at the amount of hay waste that we would see in that situation, it was down to nearly half in that treatment where they restricted those cows to only 4 hours access. So could be an option for some producers, and certainly you just want to think about what your forage quality is and how you can implement that with your operation. But if that is a simpler approach and a more effective approach based on what your capabilities are, certainly I think could be very effective there. Just a couple of decision support tools that we have that are related to this, so we always want to highlight from ksubbeef.org. They're linked back to the Ag Manager website that our agricultural economics department has put together. Our forage inventory calculator, and then that detailed cow-calf budget is really beneficial there as well too. It's more detailed from the standpoint of putting in breeding costs and health and veterinary costs, and looking at an overall a budget of from a 12-month standpoint or an annual budget, but is really effective to be able to help you manage through and understand what your current costs are and ways where you might be able to save some costs or make some changes if that's needed. So again, just some key things that I really want to implement here that I want to reiterate, and then we'll wrap up and have some time for discussion. It all comes back to, really, in my mind, 3 big things. Facilities, making sure that those are set up well, and if we have the facilities in order to be able to limit feed those cows and calves, that's going to be key for us in order to be able to do this well. And again, having the equipment and then the increased management that it requires. And if you can do those things, if you have the facilities, if your equipment allows you to be able to mix and put those rations together and do that reliably on a daily basis, and if you can implement some management, and you just have to think a little bit differently about how you approach your management to those cows, thinking more in terms of cost per cow per day, and thinking about how you might sort those cows, and understanding that it's going to look a little bit differently than what you might typically see. If you can be consistent with how you deliver that ration out there to those cows, and it fits your overall management style, I think it's certainly an option that can be very effective in managing cows through situations where we've got limited forage resources. So thing that I would encourage folks, if they have questions on this, is visit with somebody on the extension team. whether it's a local agent or one of our specialists, to be able to just kind of help work through some of these different strategies. But there's a lot of different approaches that producers can take. And again, it's all about just understanding what your costs are and what your capabilities are, and identifying whether or not it's a good fit. So that's what I have, and I think we've got time for questions. Dale.
Yes, Jason, for the audience, if you do have questions, we have the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask Dr. Warner any questions you may have on his presentation. I have a question for you, Jason. If you can discuss the response you might anticipate from younger age cows as opposed to mature cows, if this is an approach that a producer might consider.
Yeah, that's a good question, Dale. And really when you think about it, we think about those younger females, and I tend to think about 2, 3, and 4-year-old cows, really the ones that are the most critical there, because we know that they have their requirement for growth up until they're about 4 years of age. And I think certainly if we're in a situation, if we're managing those cows through the first part of their lactation period, and if those females are maybe not quite at a condition score that's going to be optimal for us, if they're thinner than what we would like to have going into the start of the breeding season, and if we can manage those females such that we can maintain body condition score on them better going into breeding, that's a situation where that can fit really well for us. I really think as I've looked at some situations where folks have implemented this approach, if you can sort those cows again, and if your facilities and the size of the herd that you have allows you to be able to do that, I think that's really beneficial. If you can take those younger, lighter weight cows that we know are going to be more timid and less apt to be able to come up to the bunk to be able to consume that allotted amount of ration. If we can take those females and manage them differently than the mature females, certainly I think that is going to be beneficial for us, and that'll really help minimize the amount of variation that you might see, because we might have some cows in that type of situation that they might be eating maybe 1.5 times their allotted amount if they're really aggressive and really compete really well. And so that we can see that spread in body condition score due to age. And so I think that really helps minimize that if we can take that approach with them. So yeah, we certainly want to take age into consideration.
Please type any questions you may have in the Q&A box.
And one thing that I'll also offer as well too, and I mentioned this, but there's a number of different ways in which folks can manage a supplemental feeding program or a creep feeding program with those calves, if they decide to leave cows and calves together and manage pairs together, going through that feeding program and through the season. Certainly a commercial type of a creep feed can fit really well. That was when you look at the information there from Dr. Brethauer there back that was done at Hayes. I think that's really critical. And if you decide not to do that and you just want to feed the exact same ration that you're already delivering to the mature females, that can work well too, just as long as you provide plenty of bunk space there. There's been some situations where folks they'll just have a separate creep area or a pen either off to the side or back at the back of the pen where those calves can escape and go out and maybe have access to some standing forage. Maybe it's a timber area or an area that's got some grass or some weeds that they can get out of the lot and have maybe a cooler place to lay down and a place where they can get some dry forage. That certainly works really well too. There's a number of different ways that folks could set that up to best fit their management and best fit their operation. Also too, if we're going to be thinking about managing bulls and going through the breeding season, you know, of course, this time of year for spring calving cows, making sure that those calves can have a spot where they can get out of the road, so we just minimize the risk of injury when we've got bulls mounting and breeding activity going on. We know that that's important as well too. So some other management things for folks to keep in mind, again, if they're going to keep calves on the cow going through the feeding period.
Again, please don't hesitate to type any questions you may have in the Q&A box for Dr. Warner. Well, Jason, seeing none, oh, we do have a question. Oh, got a thank you from Brent up in Nebraska. I think we'll wrap this session up with Dr. Warner and remind everybody of next week's session with Dr. Justin Wagner. He's going to delve into the early weaning issue that folks might consider if they continue to experience extreme drought conditions. Thank you very much for attending our Beef Team's webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.